Hello, my name is Dr. Joan Reed. I'm Dean for Culture and Community Engagement, and welcome to our program with Dr. Khalil Abdur-Rashid on mapping the landscape of Islamic bioethics. This event is being recorded, and so if you're attending in person and you don't wish to be filmed, just please let us know and position yourself so you're not in front of the camera. And then the live closed captioning is available during the Zoom, and chat will not be available, but Q&A function is. Before we begin, there's also what we call the rules of the road here at the medical school.
Go for it. I want to make sure they can see them, sorry.
Thank you. And these are basically ways of how we interact with one another, recognizing that no one's perfect, that we're all learning, that we're listening, we're inviting others to speak. Words really do matter. They can hurt and they can heal. And when we're speaking, we're respectful and listening, put yourself in others' place, and that consider alternatives. Today's event is co-sponsored with my office, Office of Culture and Community Engagement, and HMS Center for Bioethics. And I want to welcome our speaker. I have a very long bio, but I don't think he wants me to. He's going like this for those on Zoom saying, no, I'm not going to read it all, but I think it's important. It's important to acknowledge. And he is, I'm trying to get to the right page because I have pages. He's the first full-time university Muslim chaplain at Harvard University, an instructor of Muslim studies at Harvard Divinity School, and public policy lecturer at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. And he serves all Muslim students at Harvard, supervises the staff of the Harvard University Office of the Chaplain, and also serves on the Board of Religious, Spiritual, and Ethical Life at Harvard. I'm not going to go through his CV in terms of all of the places that he studied and the work that he's done. What I will say is that for us at Longwood, for those in the medical area, he has been so open and so receptive and so helpful in helping us to create community. And I want to thank him for his generosity of time and spirit and the ways in which you help all of us to be better. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. Is my mic working okay? We're good? Okay. Welcome to what I like to call mapping the landscape of Islamic bioethics. Our task today, what we'd like to do, is just literally as it sounds, map the landscape, go over a few topics, what's the general geography, topography, if you will, to use this analogy of a map, of Islamic bioethics, understand how it's used, how it's applied, what are areas that have been discussed currently, that have been discussed in the past, what are current areas of discussion, and what are topics that are still on the horizon. To leave with a few resources to understand that this is a broad topic, and so we are not, obviously, in 1 hour going to cover everything, even in this sort of general summary. But we hope that you can leave with a few tools in your toolkit, right? To be able to approach the subject with more refined questions and better understanding, and hopefully some resources as you go into your professional and communal roles. First and foremost, there are, for the Muslim community, both locally, when I say locally in this presentation, I'm going to mean the United States, of course, in our country, so locally, domestically, and internationally, the development and the application and the formation of Islamic bioethics is certainly faith-based. So it starts with a few references from the scriptural texts. In the Islamic tradition, I thought I'd highlight a few of them just so we understand what are the implications for these things, how are communities looking at these things. So first, there are a couple of references from the Quran itself. So this verse here in chapter 41, which says, we'll show them our signs in the far horizons and in themselves. And typically, theologians and Muslim theologians and jurists have interpreted this verse of the idea of discovering what's going on inside the body, right, inside of the self, both in terms of biological and chemical formations, and also what we would call today psychological and emotional development, with everything that's going on, those things, those causes, those manifestations, what's going on with ourselves, all of those things will be shown to us. They will be discovered, they will be revealed. And this obviously is not through specifically divine revelation, it will be revealed through scientific inquiry, through epistemological or empirical research and data. So this also leads us to the next verse, travel throughout the earth and see how he brings life into being. And this verse has been understood as to reflect on the idea that in different geographies and different places, we can discover different aspects of life, different aspects of organic life, natural life, human life, that culture, climate, geography can play a role in how life is impacted. And also through traveling through the earth and going to different places, going through different discoveries, we can observe how life is caused. And so the search for the causes of life, the search for the causes of even death and maladies, all of these things are praiseworthy in the Islamic tradition. There's a prophetic narrative in the hadith literature or the scripture of the Muslims as reported by the Prophet Muhammad, which says, God has sent down illnesses and cures, and God has provided a cure for every illness. So seek medical treatment, but do not treat with what is forbidden. So this is the first text that Muslim ethicists come across that not only they understand it not only to encourage treatment, but also that there are actual limits for treatment as well, and that there are certain things that you should not be used to treat, particularly members of the Muslim community, and we'll go over those limits a little bit later. A few other texts: do not harm nor reciprocate with harm. And this is called the mother text in the Islamic tradition, the do not harm text. And this is obviously, I would say, probably a universal principle. So when I was studying bioethics at Georgetown, for example, this was one of the four major principles of principalism in bioethics, in Western bioethics. We have a do not harm center in Cambridge, for example. It's not a Muslim center, but it's a center that advocates for public health and well-being and human rights based upon the paradigm of do no harm. So this also exists in the Islamic tradition, this text of do no harm. Harm is specified. There are risk assessments in the Islamic ethical tradition. Harm is understood not just in the physical sense, but also in the psychological sense, obviously emotional harm. So you find strong similarities between the way that we look at and analyze harm in the Western tradition, the American tradition, and in the Islamic tradition. There will be significant overlap with this principle, do no harm. Another text, God has not placed treatment for you in illnesses in what God has forbidden for you. Another text that says, there's treatment there, you've got to learn those treatments, find those treatments, but in certain things that are prohibited, you should not use those things for treatment. And so this is very unique and interesting in that for the Muslim community, for example, there would be questions about what are in medications, the ingredients in medications, where do certain substances come from, whether those things are deemed permissible or not in the Islamic tradition, which would impact patient care, which would impact whether patients are comfortable receiving certain medicines and treatments, and we'll go into those things a little bit later. Finally, in a nutshell, Islamic bioethics is linked to the broad ethical teachings of the Quran and the traditions of the Prophet Muhammad and the interpretations of Islamic law. Islamic law and the interpretations of Islamic law heavily govern Islamic bioethics. The general framework for Islamic bioethics are as follows. One, there is an understanding that medical knowledge is a gift from the divine. And so as a gift from the divine, the idea is that this gift is to be stewarded in responsible ways. And because it's a gift from the divine, the practice of medicine and also by extension public health, that these endeavors are seen as acts of devotional worship. Now, you might not think of yourself as engaging in devotional worship when you go into the clinic or when you go into the hospital, right? Or when you're actually teaching or if you're learning. But for Muslim bioethicists, it is very clear that universally that the practice of medicine and public health are acts of glorifying the divine, of remembering the divine, and devotional worship of the divine. And that's because through the practice of medicine for Muslim bioethicists, every aspect of engaging in this practice and medical practice and health and healing, mitigating disease, saving life, eliminating and alleviating suffering, enhancing wellness, research, all of these things are about contemplation into the world. Remember those verses that are about travel the earth and see how God has made things. And it's also built on helping the humanity in distress. And in the Islamic tradition, helping humanity in distress is an act of service. And an act of service is, by definition, in the Islamic tradition, devotional. Right? I mean, so I was on a panel, for example, last week with Lani Ali, who's the widow of the late champion Muhammad Ali, the boxer, right? And she was talking about his devotion to service, right? Why was this very important to Muhammad Ali? It was because for him and the way he understood Islam is that it's through service to others that we actually engage in devotional practice. That becomes religious. That becomes a form of prayer. And so for Islamic bioethics, the entire field of medical practice is religious and is devotional, even if the person does not think of themselves or may not think of themselves as a particularly devotional religious person. Faith itself is an instrument of healing, although in the Islamic tradition we don't generally ascribe to the idea that that faith heals purely, as in the fact that if you really just believe and you don't take Tylenol or ibuprofen, your pain's going to go away. But there is the idea that when a person is suffering, when a person is going through medical procedures, when they're struggling throughout their medical challenges, that strong faith and having faith, that is a contributing factor to health and wellness. And so strong faith has a healing component to it. And the idea that even with medicine, that one should not believe that medicine on its own, in the Islamic bioethical tradition, that medicine on its own heals, that medicine heals through the compassion and the mercy of the divine, nor should one believe, for example, that one does not need medicine to heal, that one should just live out their days just having faith in the divine, that one day one will just naturally be healed when there's actual medicine to take care of one's condition, that it is part of belief in the divine, that you take medicine. It's part of believing in the divine that you do what you need to do to cure and heal maladies and remedies, that's an extension of faith. So in that sense, from the Islamic bioethical tradition, faith is considered an instrument of healing, though faith itself is not considered medicine for ailments on its own. A patient's care in the Islamic bioethical tradition is considered the collective duty of society. Now, here's an interesting phenomenon. I wonder if you'll find this only uniquely in the Islamic tradition. This idea that we have a collective duty, that the entire community, when somebody's ill, suffering, or in pain, the entire community is responsible before God. And that responsibility remains there until that person receives treatment from the community that they need. And if one person steps in to provide treatment to that person, they have lifted the responsibility from the entire community. So their active generosity and service is so grand that they actually, by intervening, they remove the obligation on everybody else in the society to care for that person. And that's what's meant by a collective duty. And so from an Islamic bioethical stance, public health is critical. So public health becomes a form of implementing a collective duty and a collective obligation to care for others. And of course, the doctor's duty is to save and sustain and enhance life. In 2004, there was the Islamic Code of Biomedical Ethics that was developed in Cairo which issued many points, and you can look this up later, but I thought I'd outline a few of them for our purposes today, because a lot of it focused on scientific research, i.e. the idea of discovery, the act of discovery, that that there's no censorship on scientific research in Islam, that scientific research shall maintain the dignity of the person, i.e. it shall not bring about the risk of loss of dignity of a human being, nor cruelty to animals. So animal rights, for example, is very serious in the Islamic tradition. Animals may be used for research, but they also have rights similar to human beings. So human dignity is a phenomenon, is a principle that governs Islamic bioethical practice. And by extension of human dignity, animals also have dignity as well. So scientific research should be aware of that. Methodologies of research, medical research, scientific research, bioethical research and its applications shall not entail the commission of things that are prohibited in the Islamic tradition, such as tampering. We'll talk about tampering a little bit. What are the limits between treatment versus tampering, particularly as it relates to genetics? Tampering the human being's personality, their freedom, or their ability to bear responsibilities. And then the individual patient is the collective duty of society that was reaffirmed in this Islamic Code of Bioethics. And organ donation, which was a major topic in the from the 90s and the early 2000s, shall never entail compulsion, exploitation, or harm to the donor. Now we get to some of the core area of Islamic bioethics, the classification of actions for both patients and for physicians. One, there's the realm of obligations, where in Islamic bioethics, there are obligations. There's an understanding that there's an obligation to save a life or to eliminate suffering and to alleviate pain. That obligation is both on the physician and on the patient, meaning the patient themselves, from an Islamic bioethical point of view, does not have the Islamic ethical or moral right to refuse treatment when their life is at stake. And so, yes, there's patients' rights, but from an Islamic ethical point of view, you have to do whatever you need to do to save your life if that's possible, for example. So if it's possible to save a life, you could not opt, from an ethical point of view, to forego that opportunity, which people do what they want to do. We recognize that in a free society. But we're talking theoretically now from an Islamic bioethical point of view. Both the physician would have an obligation to save a life, and the patient would have an obligation to seek medical care to save their life too. Recommendation after saving a life, the next level is a supererogatory recommendation, which is to ease suffering and prevent hardships. So after life is saved, then the next objective, both for the patient and for the physician, is to ease suffering, then prevent suffering, and to eliminate all hardships, i.e. obstacles, for life to thrive, right? And so that's the next layer. Then after that are things that are cosmetics, right? Amenities, enhancements. That in Islamic bioethics is neutral, right? It's not necessarily given a moral weight. So if somebody came and said, hey, I don't like my eye color, for example, I want to do a cosmetic change, or I'd like to, enhance strength, right? Or, I want to take Wegovy, for example, just for cosmetic reasons, not for something specifically related to health, for example, or whatever the case is. So that's neutral. That's not, for example, a moral obligation, for example, or it's not discouraged, for example. But then you get into the blameworthy in terms of medical ethics, which would impact the physician, the Muslim physician, or the patient. And that's where there's a viable option there to solve a problem, and the person withholds or refuses treatment. Certainly when it comes to patient autonomy and patient rights, from an Islamic ethical, bioethical point of view, patients do have the right to refuse treatment. Patients do have the right to not consent to treatment. They do. But when there's a viable treatment option for them, and they refuse, they just say, let's say, for example, the patient says, you know what, I'm just going to rely on God to heal me, I'm going home, right? So the Islamic bioethics would recognize that patient's autonomy and their right to make that decision, though ill-informed it might be, but they will recognize their right. From an ethical point of view, that would be considered a very risky decision, though it would not be Islamically prohibitive necessarily, unless that decision involved the loss of their life. Like unless it the physician could say, if you go home, if you leave our care, you're not going to make it home, right? Or you're going to, this is going to lead to your death. That's a different case. But if a patient just really doesn't want to pursue treatment, Islamically, from an ethical point of view, bioethic point of view, they don't have to, even if options remain, but it's discouraged for them to do that. It's really discouraged. And then obviously the forbidden area would be to treat using prohibited substances, like matters related to pork or pork products, or alcohol, for example, or to harm a patient, obviously malpractice, which we. There are 5 principles that govern bioethics. If you know these 5 principles, well, you got your Islamic bioethics pretty much. You got the basic grasp of the fundamentals. One is the idea of dignity, sacred dignity. That is the idea that every human being it comes from the divine and therefore possesses dignity. And because of that dignity, it has implications on their consent. It has implications for how we treat them, how we deal with their care, end of life issues. All of these things we tread carefully with these matters. Most importantly, consent is the top priority here from an Islamic bioethic standpoint. You consent for every single thing at every single stage to honor the person's dignity, to make them aware of the risks and the challenges, the pros and the cons of all things. Right to life, obviously, is the second principle. This has implications for end-of-life care and interventions. So there is a serious Islamic weight, bioethical weight, when it comes to right to life. You do everything you can to keep that person alive. But what's interesting is that although there is a right to life in the Islamic tradition, you're not supposed to compel life. You're not supposed to force life. So when all interventions have been done and further treatment or continued treatment is deemed, medically and professionally futile, you're not supposed to keep going. There is an acknowledgement that life, the entire span of life, is a continuum, and we do what we can to facilitate it on this end. But there is a point where the person transitions on. And so when every form of treatment and intervention has been thought of, applied, and there's nothing more to be done, and the body doesn't respond, the person doesn't come back, you don't force life. You don't continue to allow a person, for example, to stay in a vegetative state, for example, to be connected to life support, open-ended, for example. You allow the person to transition on, for example. So right to life does not mean compelling life. There is a limit to that. When that limit is, typically in Islamic law, you need at minimum 2 different physicians' opinions on that, right? That treatment is futile and there's nothing more to be done. At minimum, you need 2. Equity and justice, and this plays a role in health equity, discrimination as well. Equity and justice is more in terms of bioethics, in terms of public health, a public health matter from Islamic bioethics, health for migrants, for immigrants, for example, non-citizens, for example. Equity and justice plays into humanitarian work, for example, philanthropic work. So you have a variety of charities and humanitarian causes and NGOs around the world that provide healthcare to people that are victims of war, for example, or displacement. All of these things, equity and justice, have serious implications when we talk about the provision of equal healthcare and protection from discrimination in these kinds of contexts. Compassion and public interest is the 4th principle. It impacts how care is delivered. One thing about compassion and public interest, specifically compassion, one of the important things about Islamic bioethics as it relates to compassion is care for the patient's physical self, which has to do with peaceful environment, which has to do with being comfortably covered and dignified, which has to do with the elimination or the reduction of noise, unnecessary noise, which also has to do with, privacy. All of these things are elements of compassion. The type of environment that the patient is in, all of these things. And do no harm, obviously, which governs everything. When we talk about do no harm, intention is important, outcome is important, laws are important. Those are the three elements that govern do no harm. Intent, why are we doing what we're doing? Outcome, what's the product, or what's the assumed outcome? And laws, both in terms of state laws and Islamic law as well. But laws are from an Islamic bioethic perspective, laws are important, but dispensations exist also. So you have exceptions to laws too. So from a bioethical point of view, there may be cases where the law itself may actually put the person at risk, and the exception to the law, i.e. the dispensation, is what is Islamically and ethically more appropriate, right? So there may be cases where the standard law might be that you would never treat using a prohibitive substance in Islamic law, which I just articulated earlier. That is the law of the Islamic law on that. But there may be a case where you have no other alternative. Or if you were to wait for a non-prohibitive substance to arrive, that patient's life would be at risk. So you have an emergency, you have to do what you need to do because of necessity. In that case, the dispensation becomes the law, right? So to save a life. So the ethicist, the Muslim ethicist has to understand not only what the law says, but the exception to the rule, and when that exception actually becomes the law, to save the patient, to alleviate suffering, etc., or to provide adequate care. There's a scientific challenge to bioethics. There's also a moral challenge. One of the moral challenges is, what do we mean by what does it mean to be human? Are we finished, or are we works in progress? There's a verse of the Quran that's very interesting, which says, surely we created the human being in the best of molds. We created the human being in the best of fashions. So genetics has caused, the science of genetics has caused a re-examination of this verse. What does it mean to genetically alter someone, particularly the human being? Particularly given this verse that says human beings have been created in the best of molds. If we're created in the best of molds, is it okay to change that? What does it mean to change our mold? If we change something genetically, are we changing our mold or not? Or are we still within the mold? So this is a theoretical question that the science of genetics has caused to emerge within the Islamic bioethical community. And therefore, this boundary between medicine and tampering with the mold has emerged in Islamic bioethical literature. What is tampering? What constitutes tampering? Messing with the mold, right? And what constitutes bona fide treatment and therapy? And so typically, any type of interference or intervening in a malady that a person has, an illness, a pain, or a sickness, or whatever, where the intent and the objective is to restore that patient to a normative condition, that's understood as treatment. That's clearly understood as treatment. Slight changes in the mold, changes because of genetic changes to eye color, genetic changes to hair color, changes to height, strength even, right? Slight changes are deemed permissible by many scholars, by many ethicists. Beyond that, it's considered tampering. Beyond that. But this is still a very serious and seriously debated topic. But for the most part, there's a clear understanding that the way that the human being is the final product, and that disease or illness are in some ways disruptions of that. And medical intervention seeks to correct that imbalance, to restore patients to a normative state of health. Now, what a normative state of health means, what it meant 100 years ago, for example, it would be very different from what a normative state of health means today, for example. And what a normative state of health means today, because of our access to medical knowledge and vaccines, et cetera, might be a little bit different 50 years from now. But there is an understanding that there is a normative state and there is something that's different from that. There are three principles also that are very active and prominent in this discussion, which is the preservation of lineage, preservation of human dignity, and prevention of harm, which I mentioned. With that, specifically as it relates to medical science and genetics, this is a new area of debate, discovery, and discussion now in Islamic biomedical ethics. So if you look at the topics today, for sure, gene editing is the most discussed, one of the most discussed topics, along with IFs or incidental findings. With cell editing, for Muslim scholars, they look at somatic cell editing as totally permissible, totally fine, especially for treatment. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. In utero, outside utero, it doesn't matter. Somatic cell editing for therapies and for treatment, there's no obstacles to that. Germline editing is where the question is, right? Because of what the impact might be to offspring future generations. Currently, today, there is what's called a Islamic bioethical moratorium on the topic of germline editing in the Muslim world, globally speaking. There's a pause to really think this through and see what the consequences are. There is consensus that when it comes to research on animals, however, with germline editing, that's permissible. With humans, however, not necessarily the case. It's not deemed impermissible. It's just deemed, right now, there's a question mark. Let's not proceed until we know more facts and more data. Similar to this research on embryos, in the Islamic bioethical tradition, research on embryos is permissible prior to implantation into the uterus. This is because embryos in the Islamic tradition and Islamic law do not have the status of being a human being. That's why. They get that status when they are placed, when those embryos are inserted into the womb. At that point, you've got, it takes on a different understanding and a different status as being human. So research on embryos is totally permissible in the Islamic tradition. Because of this, there are huge, well-funded, large-scale genome projects that have developed in the Middle East and the Muslim world. Some of the larger projects, the most sophisticated ones, are in Qatar, are in Saudi Arabia. Egypt has one, the United Arab Emirates does. Kuwait also has a very sophisticated project. Saudi Arabia has been specifically concerned about genetics because of the prevalence of many Saudi children that have been born with genetic birth defects. About 10% of the population, about 10% of births, have some genetic disease. And so the state is interested in this. For many Muslim countries, the science of genetics and therefore Islamic bioethics is a state issue. It's a public health issue. It's a state duty, and therefore there are a lot of funds that are put forth into this issue regarding it. Works in progress. Number one, incidental findings when it comes to research on genetics and medical research in general, and whether or not you disclose actionable results to affected relatives. So, you're doing, research and it affects the parents, and all of a sudden you realize that there's an illness or there's a disease or genetic malady, that the trait that maybe the sister has, or the brother has, or a family member has. Do you tell them or not? From an Islamic bioethical point of view. And so there's a lot of debate and discussion on that, given the role of families in Muslim society and extended family members, that the rules of who knows what and confidentiality may be a little bit different depending on cultural expectations and family dynamics about that. So there's still a lot of discussion on how to convey information to family members. Misattributed paternity is another area. Right? Do you tell the parents that so-and-so is really not the father of this child, or not? In most cases, many Muslim bioethicists have erred on the side of not saying anything at all. Although there's huge debate on this issue, it's still an ongoing matter. And the last two, adult onset only conditions, a major topic of discussion. Do you tell the child that, or the parents that when their child gets older, this genetic illness is going to kick in as when they're an adult, or do you wait for the child just to discover that themselves? What are the bioethical and Islamic implications of that kind of decision? And of course, a major aspect, which is being written about and talked about, is the prevention of genetic discrimination related to employment and social stigmas, especially in many parts of the Muslim world that have now gone down the road in requiring premarital genetic testing, not only as a matter of state legitimacy, i.e., in order to be legally married in a particular country, you have to go through premarital, not only counseling, but genetic testing, not only in terms of state legitimacy and recognition, but also as a matter of Islamic law itself. So historically, Islamic law had talked about the legitimacy of a marriage as being, the presence of the family, the consent of the bride, the consent of the groom, witnesses. Now, in Islamic law, in many Muslim countries, another condition to the validity of the marriage is premarital genetic testing. And this has been widely recognized in many Muslim countries, especially in the Middle East. Very controversial because this is an area where social stigma can be a problem. This is an area where individual autonomy, for example, what happens if a person doesn't want to go through testing? But it becomes a state's right in this way. This becomes an area where the state dominates, where public health concerns are given priority over individual rights. Pharmaceuticals, I don't want to talk a lot about this, but I do want to say is in terms of Islamic bioethics, halal pharmaceuticals, halal means that the absence of pork and alcohol products is a major global phenomenon now. The recognition of many pharmaceutical companies that are now making products, that have recognized the importance of making products and vitamins and therapeutics that are considered halal, i.e. Muslim friendly. And so it's a $107 billion global market. There's now a larger demand for halal vitamins that don't have pork or alcohol products. So for example, many capsules, for example, may have gelatin in it or may be made from gelatin. Those are prohibited. Those capsules will be prohibited for Muslims to take. So Muslims will be looking for capsules or vitamins, for example, that aren't made from gelatin, for example. So Noor-based vitamins in the United States is one company. There are many, more and more pharma companies are eyeing halal markets. South Korea is a major location for industries that are pushing for halal certification in pharmaceuticals. The top 10 consumer markets in the world for halal pharmaceuticals, you can see Turkey is the first. These are current numbers for 2025, by the way. Saudi Arabia the second. Look at the United States, it's number 3. The United States is the 3rd largest consumer for halal pharmaceuticals. Indonesia, which is 4th. So Indonesia has the largest population of Muslims globally. And yet, it's behind the United States in terms of consumers of halal pharmaceuticals. Algeria, Iran, Russia, UAE, Pakistan, and Iraq. Halal standards for pharmaceuticals have been introduced in many Muslim countries that are looking to develop their own halal ecosystems for halal pharmaceuticals. So you see Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Iraq, Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan now has an institute for the standardization of halal medicines. Indonesia's health ministry has issued halal manufacturing guidelines, and Afghanistan is now set to export painkillers, appropriately so, to the global market. All of these government projects are fueled and thrive off of Islamic biomedical ethics, determining what's the right thing to do and what are the right approaches to this. There's a huge demand as a result of this for natural medicines. And herbal regulations are being developed in many Muslim countries. Nigeria is an important case study here that is seeking to develop a regulatory council to boost the development of herbal medicines that they can then export globally. Philippines in the Asian countries, Asian, i.e. ASEAN, Administration of Southeast Asian Nations. Philippines, Vietnam, Thailand, and other non-Muslim countries in Southeast Asia recognize this market and are building capabilities in halal education. So now the Philippines are looking at trainings for Islamic bioethics and halal pharmaceuticals. Thailand as well, certification. and creating standards also globally. So this is part of global literacy now. So there's an interesting way, what's fueling this from a doctrinal point of view, there's an interesting verse from the text, from the scripture, the Quran, that fuels this notion and this drive for herbal medicine and natural remedies. And it's a verse here about the honeybee. And so the verse is, and your Lord inspired the bees, saying, build yourselves houses in the mountains and trees and what people construct, right? We see hives everywhere, right? Then feed on all kinds of fruit and follow the ways made easy for you by your Lord. From their bellies, i.e. the honeybee, comes a liquid of different colors in which there is healing for people. So the function of honey as a remedy here is mentioned in the Quran. Truly, there is a sign in this for those who think. So this verse is understood as supporting herbal remedies, as encouraging the idea that through the natural environment, there are processes that occur, that if we dig into those processes and explore those processes, we will find remedies and healings for our maladies, right? I mean, there's even a narrative from the Prophet Muhammad which talks about the fly, that says in the house fly, it has two wings, and one of the wings is a bacteria. He said, and one of the wings is an illness, and then the other wing is the cure for the illness, right? So even in one insect, you can find an illness and you can find the cure to that illness. And so there's a huge movement to look at the makeup of the outside world, the natural order, natural remedies, and to try to discover what beauties lie therein. Finally, challenges ahead. What are the things, the issues that remain certainly for the Muslim community and certainly for Islamic bioethics? Xenotransplantation is probably the largest one, where the use of organs from pigs for human transplantation and the wholesale Islamic prohibition of the use of porcine products in food and cosmetics and pharmaceuticals and medicine, except in cases of necessity. As you may know, not sure or not, there are two major companies in Cambridge that grow pig organs in the lab, and they are major producers of pig organs across the United States. We've had people that have received these organs and have it's provided life for many patients. Why pig? Because their organs can be produced a lot quicker. So it's a speedier, quicker process, better in size. And so this poses an interesting conundrum for Muslim patients on the waiting list, transplant waiting list. Porcine-based vaccination as well is another challenge for Islamic bioethics and Muslim patients and Muslim community. And of course, the dangers arising from the use of immune suppressant drugs and possibly bodily rejection and complications for patient health. So this is an area that remains significant concern for Muslims and Muslim patients, how to deal with this and what are the remedies for this. Of course, as I mentioned before, the law is important and the dispensation is important too. And of course, in cases where there's no choice and you have to save a life, then yes, it is permissible to use a pig organ for transplantation inside of the body of a Muslim. That's permissible. Egypt's Al-Azhar University has given fatwa on that. Other Muslim bioethics or Islamic bioethics organizations have issued fatwas and religious verdicts on this issue, and they're clear in the fact that in cases of necessity, saving a life it takes priority, and so in cases of necessity, you do it. But the question here is not about necessity. The question here is about norms, right? And so what could become normative and what are the implications of this becoming normative, especially globally speaking? And then the development of gene drives, which is specific for genetics and its potential to transform public health through disease eradication and its possible detriment to the environment. So, with gene drive technology and CRISPR, a woman's been cured of sickle cell, for example. You can potentially wipe out malaria, for example, by taking this technology and genetically modifying mosquitoes so that they no longer transmit the virus. You can do that to save a life. You can do that. It's a wonderful public health remedy. What about the environment? What kinds of effects or unintended consequences might emerge? Gene drive technology and CRISPR remains a major area of discussion for Muslim bioethicists today. And finally, ethical management of incidental findings. These are a few resources for you which you might be aware of, but we wanted to just put on your radar. This is the oldest one, Muslim Medical Ethics here by Jonathan Brokaw. The last two are more recent, Dr. Asim Padella's Maqasid Sharia and Biomedicine, and then Islamic Ethics and Incidental Findings, Genomic Morality Beyond the Secular Paradigm. So there's a few resources. There's some published articles on Islamic bioethics as well. I've published a paper with Dr. Asim Padella on the issue, and there are many other articles on it as well, which you should avail yourself to. So the takeaways, the practice of medicine is a devotional endeavor, and patient care is the collective duty of society. So we all have a moral responsibility. When one person steps in to save a life or to help alleviate a patient's harm and their suffering, that person plays a role in removing the burden from all of us every time that they do it. Medical treatment is an obligation to save a life and to prevent suffering. Prohibitive in general, with substances forbidden in Islam except in cases of necessity. And the 5 principles of Islamic bioethics is dignity, maintaining the person's dignity, right to life, equity and justice, compassion, and do no harm. In genetic work, there's a difference between treatment, i.e. restoring health and wellness, and enhancements, purely cosmetic work. There's a distinction there. Research on cells is encouraged, but whereas with cell editing, there's a distinction between somatic cell research or editing, and germline research, cell editing. We should be informed about the rise of halal medicine and pharmaceuticals in the global economy, and the current challenges regarding transplant with pig organs and gene drives. This is the basic sort of landscape of Islamic biomedical ethics. There are things that I haven't talked about that are also included, because we could go on and on and on. So there are things that we haven't discussed, so you'll find other matters as well, which are very important. But this information here, I sought to gather what was like most critical in terms of our awareness of the topic. What does it cover? What is it talked about? What's going on here? If I were to get wrap my arms around it, what am I wrapping my arms around? What are the core fundamentals of this area here, which is animating the world globally in different aspects in different areas. So thank you very much for your attention.
Questions?
Yes.
I have one question,
Please,
Jessica.
yes.
I'm a pediatrician.
Oh, good.
How do children and minors fit into this?
Good question. So I will repeat it, yes. So the question is, how do children and minors fit into this? So I left some slides, but it's okay. Well, I'll wing it. So basically, there is for minors, for children, children require, so their dignity applies to them as well. So consent, they have to be informed about what's going on with their treatment. One, parents, although parents retain their full ultimate decision-making capacity too. When a child reaches puberty, at that point, from an Islamic bioethical standpoint and from an Islamic law standpoint, they become a biological adult, even though intellectually they may not be fully mature. But at that point, they retain right to make a decision as well. But their decision is, while they're under the care of their parents still have ultimate say as well. So if there's a dispute between the parent and the child, then in that case, that will be negotiated, and that conflict should be resolved. So the parent's decision still retains itself until the child reaches what's called the age of maturity, which is in Islamic law for girls 18, for boys 22, 21, 22, 23. That's in Islamic law. And so at that age, they're fully deemed competent to make their own decision regardless of what anybody says. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So there's a lot of discussion, thank you, on abortion.
Yes.
All the way from the situation of rape or war crimes to risk to the mom.
Yeah.
In certain cases. And so how are scholars navigating that debate?
Right. So the question is about like abortion and and how that discussion is treated in Islamic law and Islamic bioethics. So typically on abortion, you have different opinions in the Islamic legal and ethical tradition. But in general, there is the understanding that life, there's difference of opinion in the Islamic tradition as to when life begins. There are some viewpoints, some scholars that say life begins at conception, and that's one line of thought. There's another opinion that life begins at 90 days after conception. There's another opinion that it's 120 days. There's another opinion that 40. So there's four views: conception, 40 days, 90 days, 120 days. Regardless of one's belief in terms of when life begins, after life begins, is abortion permissible in Islamic law or not? Well, certainly in the case outside of egregious cases, outside of rape, outside of war crimes, for example, just purely based on choice, okay? After conception begins, there is a distinction in the literature in Islamic law that abortion is permissible prior to one of those defined points. So if one adopts the position that life begins at 40 days, then abortion prior to 40 days is not problematic, not sinful in the Islamic tradition. If one adopts the position of 90 days, then abortion prior to 90 days is not sinful in the Islamic tradition. If one adopts the last opinion that abortion is that life begins at 120 days after conception, then before 120 days, abortion is not sinful. Either way, if an abortion occurs within that period or outside of that period, the perspective from an Islamic legal and ethical point of view is that the issue is between the mother and God. It is not a state issue. It is not a criminal issue. It is not the business of the state to get involved. So abortion would never be the state's purview. It would not be something that a woman could be criminalized for in Islamic law. There's a unanimous agreement, as far as I know, on that regard. I have never come across, in over 20 years of doing this, never come across an opinion like that. And I can tell you it's not in the classical literature, which is where the modern opinions are built or derived from. It doesn't exist. Doesn't exist. Now, those opinions that talk about where it gets prohibited is after, let's say, 120 days, because all the jurists and ethicists say for sure, from an Islamic point of view, regardless of your opinion about conception, 40 days or 90 days, after 120, that's life. There's no debate about the fact that that's life. Contemporary Muslim bioethicists actually put it distinctively of when you can hear, when the fetal heartbeat is detectable. Whenever the fetal heartbeat is detectable, a fetal sonogram, that's when life occurs. There's the universal opinion amongst contemporary Muslim scholars and bioethicists. So life is there. And as life emerges, the idea, this is important for you answering your question, as life develops, as the pregnancy continues, as the child develops more and more in utero, then the culpability becomes greater and greater as the pregnancy progresses and as the child is forming more and more until birth. It's never deemed killing a child or murder until after birth, right, or at the time of birth. So in that case, at the time of birth, if the infant is killed or terminated at the time of birth, or when the child is coming out and the child is alive or makes a sound and then the child is terminated, at that point there's culpability on the physician and the person who made the decision for the abortion, late-term abortions we might call it. Right? In that case, the state's involved from an Islamic point of view. In cases of rape, incest, or war crimes, abortion in the Islamic tradition is totally permissible, but it's the woman's choice in that matter. If she keeps the child, that's considered a great act of compassion, but it's her choice. Classical Muslim jurists even debated and discussed the permissibility of abortion purely on economic reasons, like you can't afford another child, could you do it or not, right? Let alone in cases of violation. So in general, in the Islamic tradition, it's always a woman's choice. One, it's never the state's prerogative unless that child exits the womb and the life is taken in conjunction with the mother and the physician. And in both cases, both are culpable. And between that, after 120 days, when life is clearly, or after after the heartbeat is detected by fetal sonogram, if the abortion occurs, then it is considered, it's not considered murder, it's not considered taking a human life, but it is considered a sin because it's interrupting the process of life, particularly, specifically human life. So the idea of life in the Islamic tradition is that there's organic life, and then there's human life. There's this development, and human life is a continuum until birth, right? At birth, it's mature, and so there's a trajectory, and so abortion after 120 days interrupts that process, and the interruption of that process is wrong without a valid, legitimate Islamic reason. If one detects a genetic abnormality, for example, and fears for the well-being of that child because of a significant genetic abnormality, because of the parents, being impoverished, for example, and the cost of caring for that child and the child's constant medical needs as predicted by the genetic test, if that's going to be prohibited, for example, could one make a decision to abort a child? Many scholars would say yes. Many ethicists would say there's no blame in that situation. Other ethicists would say, no, in this case, take your faith, rely on God, God provides. So within that process, there's still not a uniform decision about culpability, even in that case. And so the Islamic tradition, the ethical tradition, is built on divergent opinions on many issues. In the context where you have divergent opinions, in the Islamic tradition, the patient and any Muslim has the right to adopt any position in that tapestry, any theological, Islamic legal, theological, ethical position. They can adopt that position. They are fully within their rights to adopt it, and they may not be blamed. Even if, in the patient's view, that abortion is permissible, and in the parent's view or the family's view, it's not. If they're following a legitimate opinion on that issue, which on abortion there's many legitimate opinions, then that's that patient's right. And at the end of the day, it's a decision they make between them and God, and you leave it at that. It's a long issue. I mean, I've been long-winded, but it's a deep issue, and it deserves, I think, some proper.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. It was very interesting. I have a question about the line between right to life, but not forcing life.
Yes.
So I have two questions on that. One, I imagine that changes over time. Like at one point, ventilators were considered perhaps extraordinary means, and now in many cases, that's a standard of practice. So how do you determine what is considered right to life and what is do not force life? And then I can ask a second question that's on that topic.
Yes.
You said who determines that, and you said you need two different physicians. At least. So I was wondering if there's an obligation on the patient if there is a treatment to extend life, they must do that. Is it also an obligation upon them to not force life as well?
Good question. Yeah. I had a teacher overseas a long time ago. He said, Khalil, if you really want to be a good teacher, if you really want to be a wise teacher, someone asks you a question, say, it depends. So it depends. No. For the first question, we have now developed a system, when I say we, Muslim ethicists, but of course, in the medical profession, it's given in this case, risk assessments for the probability of someone surviving based upon a given intervention and based upon how tests and readings and things you can predict. Okay, based upon past precedents as well, experiences. This has become an empirical science. So when that opinion is given, that we've done all we could, there's a 5% chance of the person could survive, but most likely in our experiences, we've never had a case with us that. Then when it's permissible, it's permissible to withdraw life support. But particularly your question was about forcing life, right? As I understand it. One is forcing life when the interventions that are used cross the boundary of life support to actually not only harming the patient, but also denying other patients access to the resources at the same time. So if you're dealing with a situation where you've got two life support systems in the hospital and you've got a patient that has not responded, they've been on life support for, I don't know, a month, and the general consensus is that there's no hope, right? It's futile, it's deemed futile. And not only that, but if you continue to have this patient connected, you'll have significant risk of further infections and this, that, and the other, right? I mean, I'm not a, when I got my doctoral degree, my mother gave me a shirt that says, "I'm not that kind of doctor," right? It says, so I'm not a physician, right? And you are, right? So
I can.
this is where we're getting at when the treatment is futile, and at the same time, that treatment has a good chance of saving and helping the life of another patient or patients in the hospital. At that time, you're forcing life. And from an Islamic point of view, that's considered selfish. And it's considered something that through compassion, we have to intervene with the mom, dad, husband, wife, whoever is the decision maker, and help them understand that it's in the best interest of this patient to allow life to continue. You let them transition to death in the next life. Let life continue, and not further disrupt that transition. And your last question was about
If the patient, it's also obligatory upon the patient not to force life, or if that obligation is only on the physicians, which you said you need two separate physicians.
it's on the physicians to convey the information.
Okay.
Yeah,
It's the ethical
Yeah.
decision.
it's the physician's decision, and the Muslim patient needs to accept their profession if those physicians are qualified in that area.
Yeah.
And not every physician is qualified in every area, right? So the moment you've got one physician is sufficient, but in the legal tradition, you need two. You need two that say, in our professional opinion, this is not going to work. And then in that case, that burden of killing, if you will, taking a life, is removed. So it's not taking a life anymore. Yeah, I'm sorry, do you want to say something?
Yeah, I'm a physician.
And a bioethicist?
And a bioethics.
Yes.
Yeah. I would like to answer this question a little bit additional to our school, Dr. Khalil, that we call this brain death. Brain death, it means that if someone will prove that someone came back from brain death, the Muslim scholars will not allow this to euthanasia or to stop this life. That's why it's never happened. That's why the doctor said, if this brain death, we can decide that this patient, after this time, just as a herbal life. That's why he cannot be continued this life. And the patient's relatives, we are saying that you can take your patient to home. That's why in the Muslim countries, the euthanasia is not allowed. That's true.
So DNRs would be interestingly problematic for Muslims in many ways. I mean, you could sign it, but it would be ethically questionable if the life could be saved. Another question?
I think it's a question of
yes.
online.
Online, yes.
She'll read it out. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you so much for such an engaging lecture. You mentioned not changing the mold. How does this apply in reconstructive surgery after, say, burns or breast cancer? Similarly, assuming biopsies are permissible.
Yeah, good question. So, this is under like restorative care. It's cosmetic. It's called cosmetic, but from an Islamic ethical point of view, it's not cosmetic, not in the same sense, right? So it's restoring the patient to, having skin in the case of burns, or having, reconstructive surgery for the way their face should be or would have been, or something close to it, or reconstructing their hands the way it should be or could be, right? So the idea is that it's not cosmetic, it's reconstructive. Reconstructive, I don't have the slide up, but for example, here, I can do this, it's easier. just really quickly to make the point, the first slide, I think, to answer the question, where is it here? Is it? Here it is, this slide, current slide. The last part here, no, the number 3, ability to bear responsibilities. So, someone's personal, so you could not tamper with a person's ability to take care of their responsibilities in life. So if a person has an accident, car accident, burn, whatever the case is, victim of a crime, and they develop an impairment because of that, shot, right? Whatever the case is. The reconstructive surgery is there not only for quality of life, but from an ethical point of view. Why is that important? It's because that person has responsibilities. They have a life. They have people that they have to go back to work. They have people that care about them. They've got to live. They've got to cook. They've got to do this. They got to engage in society, go out and meet people. They have responsibilities to live, and live is not just about having a heartbeat. Live is about engaging in social life, in moral life, in ethical life, in communal life. And so that is what's being restored, right? And so in that sense, that act of restoring that process or restoring that patient's ability to do that through facial reconstructive surgery or transplant or whatever the case is, that's an act of great service, which is an act of devotion. Does that make sense? I hope that answered the question. So, yeah, in the back.
Thanks very much. Thank you very much. So I'm curious, to what extent does the bioethical framework extend to say that there are certain areas of study that would actually be obligations to study and direct rather than passively react to or provide an opinion on a certain direction?
Yeah.
And I ask that as more than a philosophical sort of way of thinking. Clinical trials are a big part of how we do medicine, right? And so to what extent are avenues of study guided or could be guided by a bioethical framework? Because not all science is funded equally, right? So I'm curious to what extent the framework provides an opinion on that.
I would love for that to be a bumper sticker. Not all sciences are created equal or are equal. That's very true. It would depend. So there's this classification we talked about earlier, which was the area of communal obligation, the duty to serve and protect and save life because the community is impacted by something. The moment that malady, that illness that's in the community is solved, that no longer becomes a communal obligation. So let's say there's a cure for hypertension, blood pressure, high blood pressure. There's a cure for it. There's a pill you can take, takes care of the high blood pressure. I mean, one day, hopefully we'll get there. So now, any research on that medication or hypertension no longer becomes a communal obligation, no longer becomes a priority. It becomes maybe neutral or recommended. It drops in its category. Remember the categories that I had earlier? That one. But let's say hypertension is not solved yet, right? Still a problem, public health problem, etc. So therefore, any research in the area of trying to discover a cure for hypertension or better treatment, even though there might be good treatment, maybe there's a better treatment for hypertension, that still remains at the level of communal obligation. Communal obligation. At that point, it's game for anybody to get in and do the research. And every person that's involved in that project, from an Islamic bioethical standpoint, is engaged in a form of worship of God, interestingly enough, to discover where and how God is secretly hidden the cure and to discover it. Pull it up, it's like finding buried treasure. That's not only the case for hypertension, diabetes, AIDS, you name it, the entire gamut. Now, not only just at the bodily level, at the psychological level, for mental health illnesses, exact same thing, for dentistry, and also for genetic illnesses as well. Each of those areas remains in the broad category of communal obligation. And it's retained itself as top priority so long as the community, the public, is significantly impacted by that. Significant impact is determined by deaths, rate of deaths, public spending on the issue, because healthcare is a significant budget, a part of the state budget, federal budget. So costs, when costs go to healthcare, costs are taken, money's taken from other things. So it becomes a fiscal priority, a resource priority from an Islamic point of view. We have to solve the problem. So all medical issues and concerns from individual health to public health that are not dealt with, that are not solved, that retain them, that still are major priorities, are all granted an equal rate of priority as being top priority and equally valid, equally meritorious, and also an act of worship as well, whether the person is religiously inclined or not. Right? It's a search for truth. And the search for truth is an act of worship in Islam. It's an act of recognizing things. And sometimes, you find cures in the most odd places, whether it's the honeybee, right? Or whether it's many other places. So it's all at that level to save a life. Whereas a police officer who's a firefighter, right, who's rushing into a burning building and pulls somebody out and saves their life, that's meritorious. You have to have firefighters. But then a certain number of firefighters where you'll reach a limit where, okay, we've got 50 in the city, that's good enough to handle our priorities. Then once you reach that limit, you can be a firefighter in Islam, but there may be another way that you could save a life or intervene that becomes more meritorious in that sense. So you can still be a firefighter, but it's not as critical as it's the same thing with research. Does that make medical research? Does that answer your question? Yeah.
First of all, Jazakallah khairan for your talk. I have two questions. My first one is about refusal or denial of care. Yeah, sorry. Refusal or denial of care for people with psychiatric illnesses. And the second question is about organ donation and human body donors for medical education and how that aligns with like ghusl and this ritual cleansing of the dead.
That's a deep question. Okay. Let's take that one by one. Okay, first, remind me the first one again?
The first one?
No, it's okay, I'll repeat it.
Okay, it's about like psychiatric
care, yes.
Yeah, refusal of care.
Right. So in Islamic tradition, if someone has a psychiatric illness, they go through a process where they may be deemed incompetent of being able to make their own decisions. If that is legally the case, then all their decisions go through a guardian, pure and simple. They don't have the ability to consent anymore. Everything goes through a guardian. If that person has not reached that level, it's not at that level, but they're in treatment, so they still have the right to consent or to refuse treatment. Are they allowed to refuse treatment in Islamic bioethics? Yes, they are allowed to, unless their situation is significant enough to where if they don't receive treatment, it's a mortal decision, right? It impacts their life. If their decision just impacts their well-being, right, or their general safety, it's a problem, but it doesn't reach the threshold to compel treatment from Islamic bioethics. So let's say somebody's dealing with dementia, right? A grandparent dealing with dementia. And the child, who's an adult, is telling the institution, hey, I need my dad. I need you to lock his door, and just make sure he can't, because if he gets out and starts walking around, he might be in Boston, so we have no idea. I need you to, the child is trying to advocate. They're trying to make a decision, but that person who has dementia may not have full-blown dementia. They still have some faculty, some capacity. So if there's not a legal reason or a legal paperwork to say that their decision is null, then you still have, that institution's responsible now to do what that institution should do to protect them. But they could not compel that patient to sign away their rights, for example. They could not do that from an Islamic ethical point of view. They still have dignity. And their dignity now has to be protected in different ways, given their diminished or perceived diminished or clinically diminished capacity or decision-making, impairment, whatever the case is. But there are different go-arounds, right? With organ donation from a person, right? You're talking about a person, right? Who's alive or deceased?
Deceased.
who's deceased, if they've already said
And
so.
also like human body donors, like for medical research.
Right.
Or medical education.
Good point. Okay, there are two types of organ donation in Islam. One is the donation of organs that regenerate, or you have two of: kidneys, liver, skin. That you can donate all day, not all day long, but you can donate, and it's your decision. Outside of that, you could not, right? And so after death, at the moment of death, could you do that or not? Well, you could not donate if the person themselves said, yes, I want to be an organ donor. Yes, you could do that. If the person has not given their consent, it may not be done under any circumstances at all. Now, if the person's given their consent, in the case of my untimely death or death, feel free to use my organs for life-saving purposes or for research. That's their decision. That's fine. There's a debate about that in Islam. One, is that permissible or not? One, because your ownership of your body from an Islamic point of view ceases at the time of death. It becomes the communal responsibility and it goes into the custody of your family. So you couldn't, according to that view, you don't own your body anymore. You're deceased. You don't own anything anymore. Everything goes to the relatives, right? The family. So you don't have decision-making capacity, and whatever you said in your life doesn't play out here because people can change their minds all day long until right before death. So whatever decision you made about organ donation 10 years ago would not apply today. That's that opinion that, no, you can't donate unless it's right at the time of death, right before, Bob, you want to donate? Yes. Oh, yeah, that kind of thing. In that case, the other opinion is that you could donate, and not only could you donate, if there's a convincing reason, if a team comes to you and says, or family says, we hear about, there's the community needs more donors, and we think, we wonder if you might be interested in this, that the act of donation is the ultimate form of service to others. And because of that, and it also saves a life, can save a life. So because of that, not only is it encouraged, it is highly recommended and encouraged and should be done. So there's two differing opinions on this in Islam. Again, but when you've got multiple opinions, people can take whatever opinion and go with it. They may not be blamed on either side. Now, whatever decision let's say a person makes the decision to donate, they're going to donate. There is one universally agreed upon strict condition about donation. There can never, ever be any monetary transaction on that organ. It has to be a pure gift and donation. No money exchanged, no prices, no financial transaction, nothing. Because of the strict prohibition on monetizing any part of the human being. So there's strict laws about that in the Islamic. They're just as strict as not eating pork and not drinking alcohol and not gambling. So you could never sell an organ. You could never profit from an organ. You could never, it has to be donation, real donation. Even the people, the physicians doing the transplant, they cannot be paid from the proceeds of that. They have to be paid from a different source completely. So it's just like if you donated a meal to a homeless person, you can't pay you couldn't take, let's say you had $20 to donate, you couldn't take like $5 to pay the Uber driver and then $15 for the meal. It's $20 donation, all that $20 has to be a meal that goes direct to that person in Islamic law and Islamic ethics. Same thing with the organ. So the organ has to be completely given to the other person and no strings attached, no financial compensation or commodification in any way.
But the last part of the question of giving up one's body for medical research, for training, for education.
Yeah.
Also using that, like for example, we have like human body donors and then we use
Yeah, so so that part of that question is a different thing. So in the past it's been done. I'll tell you this from past precedents in Islam, in Ottoman, Turkey and the Ottoman provinces, it was done. In Egypt, it was done. We have a lot of evidence, actually some of the most profound evidence we have of medical research of being done on cadavers is in Egypt, actually, World War I, World War II, actually. I mean, recent history, like 19th century. The books. So it's for education, it's permissible because it comes under the category of communal obligation. Students have to learn. And they can't just learn on like guinea pigs all day. You know, they have to have actual experiences. And as a general rule, you know, desecration of the body is totally prohibited in the Islamic tradition. When somebody dies, they're buried within 24 to 48 hours. You cannot take anything from the body. And as a general rule, the Prophet said after the person dies, be very careful and gentle with the body, because after the moment of death, the deceased feels in the same way the living person feels. So in other words, the detachment of the soul from the body is a process that takes time. Although death might be instantaneous, there's still connections there that take a while for the actual severance to occur. And so that's why in Islamic law, we don't cremate bodies. It's like you're burning somebody alive. Almost would never cremate somebody. You would never, you know, just rough up a person. You know, when you wash and prepare the body, you wash with warm water. You don't wash with cold water, because you would not like somebody to put cold water on you, right? So in preparing the body for the grave, you actually treat the person like they're alive, like you're dealing with a baby, for example, that's living. And so in that sense, the use of bodies for medical practice, not only experimentation, but, you know, demonstration, teaching, and learning would require somebody who has not recently died, for example. So this would not be somebody who died within like 24 hours, 48 hours. What the specific limits on that are, I'm not sure, to be honest with you. But I do know that it is permissible for educational purposes, yes. And it has been, as is demonstrated by recent modern Islamic history. There's been no debate on that. But when the clock starts as the most appropriate time, certainly it's not within recent death. So this would be an older corpse.
But that require consent nonetheless.
It does still require consent. Yes, it does. It does. You couldn't do it on somebody who's not. Ethically, you could never do it on somebody who's never consented for that. But now the other piece is what was used in Egypt, and many others were like criminals and stuff. But still, that is, that's because the state custody, the state's making the decision on their wards, right? And so the state says, okay, these are people that died in custody, died in prison. We're making a decision that these are the resources that you can use for education.
And parents?
Parents as well. Yeah.
There's one last question. It says, thank you again for this. Another question is regarding getting treatment during Ramadan. Some patients refuse treatment around that time. Is there a hierarchy on when to receive treatments during fasting, like IV treatments?
There may be some patients to decline treatments specifically during Ramadan, because if that in treatment may entail the breaking of the fast, and that person is within their rights to say, you know what, I don't want to do this now. I'll wait next week to the end of Ramadan, or I'll wait till the week after. They're within their rights to do that, provided that treatment now obviously is not, the person's sick enough in Ramadan that they're actually in the hospital, then they're not going to fast. They're not going to be fasting anyway. So, but in the short answer is this: universally in Islamic ethics and in Islamic law, consult your physician. That's the universal rule. Consult your physician, explain to your physician what Ramadan is, what the requirements of fasting are. This is Islamic law, by the way. Explain to them what fasting is, what Islamic law is for fasting, what breaks the fast. So this will require Muslims to better understand what breaks the fast. And if there's not a clear understanding, ask a trained scholar or read about it. One of the biggest sheikhs in the world is Sheikh Google. So you can consult Sheikh Google and Sheikh AI on matters what breaks the fast in Ramadan, and it'll tell you. It'll give you a nice Google or AI fatwa. Check that with a human being, though. So once you have a general idea, go to the physician and say, I really don't want to break my fast because I don't want to make it up. And see if that treatment is able to be delayed. In many cases, that may be the case. And there's no blame on that. So there's a neutral approach to this. If the treatment is not life-saving, then it requires consent, it requires consultation. The Islamic law says consult with the physician. When not dealing with life-saving matters, non-life-saving matters, for treatment during Ramadan, consult the physician. not two, one, your physician. If in that consultation, if the physician says it's okay to delay, you delay. If the physician makes a professional, in their professional opinion, says that delaying treatment will place the patient at greater risk of harm, worsen their symptoms or worsen their illness, or cause something different to happen, in that case, it becomes religiously more responsibility to follow the advice of the physician. And in that case, in Islamic law, that person who has to forego the missed fast day has a dispensation to practice Ramadan for that day in a different way. And they feed somebody for that day that they missed. And that becomes the way they honor the fast. And so their health is most important. The Prophet said to a man who he saw was fasting in Ramadan, and the man was, because the Prophet was traveling with a group and they were in the desert walking, and the man was very tired, and the Prophet had told the people, don't fast because we're traveling. And so the man fasted anyway, and the man was dizzy, and he fell and he passed out because of heat exhaustion. And so the Prophet Muhammad asked the crowd, like the crowd gathered around him, and they revived him. They said, what's wrong with the man? They said, oh, Prophet Muhammad, he's fasting. He said, this is not righteousness. Right? This is not what God wants out of you. So the general rule from somebody who's traveling is that you don't have to fast in Ramadan. That's a traveler. We live in like air conditioning and but travel itself is stressful. It's difficult. Your flight could be delayed. There are a lot of difficulties that's there. So there's just environmental difficulties. And in the case of environmental difficulties, one may adopt the position of fasting on a different day. So certainly in health, in consultation with the physician, if that decision is going to impact their health, then no, they forego the fast, but they honor the Ramadan by fasting differently, i.e. they feed a poor person for that day that they missed. And if they recover or they get better, then at the end of Ramadan, they make that day up. So that's it. Okay, hope that's all right.
I want to just say thank you. I have learned.
Joe, do the.
I want to say thank you. I have learned so much. I'm sure those who are here and those who are online have also learned. And for me, it's a wonderful example of the ways when we come together, we can learn more about each other and dispel the myths and the assumptions. For me, find that there are so many things that we also have in common. It doesn't make us different, that there are many things we have in common. So I thank you. I thank you for taking the questions and giving us such considered answers. I am hoping that there will be more times when you can share your wisdom with us and we can come together as a community.
Thank you. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you.